Hello, good evening, everyone. 521 years ago, tens of thousands of Jews, Sephardic Jews, left Spain, left their Sepharad, with many different destinies. Today we are here in Harvard University, in this Fong auditorium, to talk about some of their descendants. Welcome to this event of the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Welcome to the Observatorio of the Spanish Language and Hispanic Cultures in the United States. My name is Francisco Moreno Fernandez. I'm the Executive Director of the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard. And before the screening, I just want to say thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Department of Romance Languages and Literature for co-hosting this event. And thanks to Santander University's division of Santander Bank for sponsoring our program. And welcome to the Consul General of Spain, welcome to the representative of Santander Bank, and welcome you all. This evening is essentially a conversation. It's a conversation in the Observatorio, in the observatory, and today the conversation is about Sephardic Jews. The program includes the screening of the film Once Upon a Time at 55th and Hoover, a short documentary, 28 minutes, by Andrés Enrique-Arias. This documentary tells the story of the Spanish-speaking Sephardic Jews from the island of Rhodes that arrived to Los Angeles at the first half of the 20th century and established a community in the area around 55th and Hoover in South Central Los Angeles. After the screening, there will be a film discussion with three experts, Luis Girón, Javier Pueyo, and Andrés Enrique-Arias, and then we have some coffee and cookies for everyone. So thank you for being here. Thank you for coming today with this snow, this weather, and enjoy the film. Thank you very much for your attention. As I said before the screening, this event is organized as a conversation in the Observatorio, in the Observatory of the Spanish Language. So the Observatorio program and projects are concerned about Spanish and Spanish speakers in the United States. Pay special attention to the contact of the Spanish with other languages and to its presence as a majority and minority language in different environments, and to how this language is perceived by the speakers, especially as a factor of identity. And since we are concerned about the Spanish as a minority language, you may understand easily our interest about other minorities, especially the minorities within the Hispanic domain. So the Observatorio conducts analysis, studies, and reports concerning the social and linguistic state of the Spanish language and its communities also. And the Sephardic is a very special community and among all the Hispanic communities. So for this film discussion, we are very happy for having here with us three experts in the Sephardic world. Let me to introduce them before giving them the word. Luis Girón. Luis Girón is, he doesn't need an introduction in this house. Anyway, he's a professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and of Comparative Literature in this Faculty of Arts and Sciences in Harvard. He's the director of the undergraduate studies and undergraduate advisor in Romance Studies. His academic degrees are A.B. Mathematics and Philosophy, Harvard University, NTS Harvard Divinity School, ME and PhD in Religion and Literature, Harvard University. His research interests are medieval and Golden Age Spanish literature, medieval Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew literatures, and history of religions. Some of his major publications are Las coplas de Joseph entre la Biblia y el Midrash en la poesía judeoespañola, published in Madrid in 2006, and Alfonso de la Torre's Visión Deleitable, Philosophical Rationalism and the Religious Imaginations in 15th Century. Javier Pueyo He's a Spanish researcher. Since 1999, he holds a tenured position as a scientist at the Spanish National Research Council within the Sephardic Studies Research Group. Besides his philological, literary, and linguistic interests and research in medieval Spanish and Judeo-Spanish, his works is focused on the natural language processing and corpus linguistics fields, and also on the analysis of open source software communities and technologies. And one of his most important publications are the edition of the Romance Bible from the Royal Academy of the History in Spain. And finally, Andrés Enrique-Arias, the director, the scriptwriter of the film, the producer of the film, he holds a PhD in Hispanic linguistics at the University of Southern California. He's a tenured professor of Spanish language in the University of Balearic Island in Spain, where he teaches history of the Spanish language. And also he made the transcription and studies of the Escorial Bible in 2010. As you may guess, they have many interesting things to say. So thank you very much for your collaboration, for your presence in this conversation, and go ahead. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Back here. All right, so I'll be the first one. Thanks a lot to the Cervantes Institute and the Santander Bank for their support and for making the screening possible. Like you just said, I think it's a great idea to do this sort of event, because when people think of Spanish-speaking communities in the United States, people usually don't think about the Sephardic Jews as one of these communities. One of the communities that actually has a long tradition in this country, in many cities, and in all the areas in the United States. I was fortunate, even though I didn't really realize it at the time, to catch a glimpse of a world that really is fading away very fast, right? When I was a graduate student, I was doing some research and fieldwork among the Sephardic communities, and I thought it was a good idea to record some of it, and now I see that indeed it was a good idea, because really these two ladies that we've seen here, Regina and Rebecca, were really the last two survivors of the generation of people born in Rhodes that were in that community in Los Angeles. Really what I wanted to do with the film was not so much document the language itself, because there are many great studies. Actually, the Sephardic Judeo-Spanish or Ladino language is one of the areas or the varieties in Romance linguistics that has been studied more thoroughly. What I wanted to do more is to record some of the attitudes of people. How do they feel, as members of a minority language group that is vanishing so quickly? And I feel that the film portrays in a compelling way the typical attitudes that we see. We saw in the case of Rebecca, we saw defiance. She says, I told my daughter, don't talk to me in English. I don't understand. I insisted in her learning Spanish, and I use Ladino as much as I can, because I don't want the language to die out. And we have the opposite attitude in Regina. We see how Regina, her attitude is of acceptance. Even she's very happy that she learned English very well, and she can read it and write it, and now her husband can't make fun of her anymore, so she's really proud of it, And between this defiance and acceptance in the middle, we have Art Benveniste, the younger member of the community, who has this feeling of regret that we were not interested as young people, and now it's too late to do anything about it, right? That's how he feels. He feels that they should have done something, but now it's too late. So this is something that you don't see in that many films. There are so many films about Sephardic Jews. It's a very intriguing and interesting topic for a lot of people, but usually you don't see this sort of angle, and this is what I was trying to do, something a little bit different. So the other thing that I see is the big paradox that we see here. These people left Rhodes to escape economic hardship, to escape also religious persecution with the Nazis. And they did arrive to the United States and find economic stability, prosperity, security, but they had to pay a price, which is they lost their language and their culture. And this story there's nothing new about this. This is what happens with stories of immigration, right? Migrations. Typically, people gain on one side, but they lose on other side, right? So this was another thought that I think I'm trying to portray in the film. And finally, another idea that I like to throw is that I find fascinating the changing cultural and linguistic landscape in inner city communities. How South Central LA is like a notorious African American area. That's how it was in the 60s and the 70s. Now it's changing, becoming Hispanic. But it was Hispanic before in a way. That's something that nobody thinks about that, right? That area of 55th and Hoover was a Spanish-speaking neighborhood between the 1920s and the 1950s. And now it's Spanish-speaking again, gradually. So it's interesting to see how things evolve and change. And these are just a few ideas that I was trying to convey in the film. And now my constituents here
Okay.
You want to go next?
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I should start by saying that my field of expertise is not modern Judeo-Spanish or Ladino, but rather I usually work with texts from the 16th century, biblical translations, and other religious texts. So, having said that, I would like to take the advantage of this event to clear up a pretty major and common misunderstanding about the Judeo-Spanish language, which is the language of Regina and Rebecca. I'm talking about a misconception that is repeated over and over again by folklorists, musicians, Spanish language mass media, the general public, but as well by scholars dedicated to the study of other varieties of Spanish language and literature. The problem is that many people portray and think of Judeo-Spanish basically as a medieval or 15th century version of Spanish frozen in time, with some Hebrew, some Turkish, and some Arabic words thrown into the mixture as if they were spices added to a dish. As a consequence, many linguists will characterize Judeo-Spanish as an archaic variety of Spanish with archaisms, that is, words preserved from Old Spanish, from 15th century Spanish, and that the Sephardim preserved those words out of love for the lost Sepharad, for the lost Spain. But let me tell you that the Sephardim did not love Spain all that much after 1492 for obvious reasons. And the Ladino was a 15th century language, but only during the 15th century, as it was a 20th century language from the year 1900 to the year 2000. I think you get an idea, which is that the language changed and the language evolved, and it wasn't frozen as a frozen food. So the fact that the Ladino didn't lose lots of medieval Spanish words, it didn't lose structures, syntactical structures, or morphological features from medieval Spanish, that doesn't mean that the Sephardim were working hard to keep them as if they were doing it on purpose. Actually, Judeo-Spanish lost many, many, many words and structures that has been preserved in modern Spanish. And we don't say that modern Spanish is a frozen variety of Judeo-Spanish. It's something that's characterized the history of the Ladino language is quite the opposite. Its marked tendency to change, to live in variation, that is to be diverse, both in the sense of having different geographical varieties and also in presenting those variants within the speech of the same speaker. It also has a marked tendency to incorporate words, forms, structures, and literary motifs and topics from the surrounding languages of the communities where the Sephardim had settled over the centuries. If we pay less attention to the wonderful subtitles in English provided in the film and pay more attention to actual Ladino spoken by Regina and by Rebecca, we will be able to notice these two interesting facts that linguistic facts that I have mentioned. The first one is that Regina and Rebecca don't always speak exactly in the same way. They pronounced the same Ladino words in different ways. For example, they usually said hija, hijo, but they also used hijo, hija, which is the traditional form in Ladino. And they also used different forms to express some morphological features, like the diminutive in Spanish. In modern Spanish is ito. They used ito as in mayorcito, but they also used the traditional Ladino form, ico, like, what's the word she says, pueblecico or pueblico. That is called variation, and it's something that we find in all language, and is the mechanism that propels language change. And the second fact that we may notice if we pay attention to what Regina and Rebecca said in Ladino, they use different they use words from different linguistic origins, such as we hear, for example, Turkish words like Art says karpuz, watermelon, or Regina says yapraki, grape leaves, or boreka, which is a pie or a pastry thing. And we also hear Hebrew words, like when Regina said keilah for community or synagogue, huevos jaminados, boiled eggs, which is a mixture of Spanish and Hebrew, because jamin means hot in Hebrew, or Gan Eden, heaven, or when Rebecca said lashon de mi padre, the language of my father. Lashon is Hebrew for language. Finally, we also hear words that come from French, such avenir for future, arrivimos, we arrived, from the French arriver, or from Italian. She said lavoraban, they worked, from the Italian lavoro or lavorare, to work. All these words and expressions and many others were assimilated by the native communities during the period of the Ottoman Empire. Moreover, you will also notice words, sounds, and morphological forms borrowed from modern Mexican Spanish, as when they say mayorcito instead of mayorcico, or when they say judío instead of judío, which is a Jewish, which is a form of traditional Ladino, gente instead of gente, or aprender, which means to learn, instead of the traditional ambesarse, although Regina uses both forms, I think. And of course, there are words taken from English. You'll notice those, I guess. For example, Rebecca says soportar, from the English support, and she also says blocos, from the English block, and they also use picnic or mayorita, from English majority. And that's what I would call a perfect 20th century Angelino Ladino or Judo-Spanish from Los Angeles, and now a living recreation of medieval Spanish frozen in time. Well, let me finish with a sad and maybe controversial thought. Ladino is not dying. Ladino has already died. It died when Regina and Rebecca passed away, and it dies over and over again every time a native speaker of Ladino departs and does not pass the language to the next generation. There are enormous efforts carried out by the Autoridad Nacional del Ladino and the Instituto Cervantes in Israel to preserve the language. And there are also many universities in Israel that teach the language. But none of those efforts will be ever able to aviviguar la lengua, bring the language back to life. In order to exist, the language needs a community in which it is spoken, and that no longer exists for Ladino. I have something to add what Andrés beautifully said in the documentary. He said that a world dies when a language dies, which is true, but the opposite is also true. When you lose a world, you lose the language in which that world was expressed. Ladino was the language of a traditional world in which the Sephardic Jewish communities lived. In this traditional way of life, the oral literature of the Sephardim, including the Meldado, or the reading of the Bible, which was oral for them, and the daily language pleasantly used to live and to change. But all this traditional world was destroyed both by modernity and by cruelty, the most horrendous cruelty known to mankind. In my opinion, the only way to keep alive the customs, the culture, the literature, and the language of the Sephardim is to preserve as much as possible and as soon as possible all what still remains. Las dichas, the sayings, las cantigas, the songs, las romanzas, the ballads, the music, and the personal and communitarian memories. As we do with our most beloved ones when they pass away, the memory of the Ladino language and the heritage of its speakers must be preserved and must be honored and must be retold. Academic editions of old Ladino texts, which is what I do, is one step in that direction. The collecting of the tales, music, the songs, the poetry is another step, and beautiful, informed, and inspiring documentaries, as the one we have watched today, is yet another one. We need to keep moving along this path and working against the clock before further ancient manuscripts, all editions, and the last generation of native speakers of Ladino all vanish forever. Thank you. No, please.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit more informal, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to celebrate Andrés' wonderful contribution to the archival documentation of modern Sephardic culture. And I also want to follow Javier's point, about the temptation to create a caricature of Sephardic culture as some kind of a living relic of medieval traditions frozen in time. Now, it interests me also, partly because I'm a medievalist. I'm a hardcore pre-modernist down to my DNA molecules. I'm trained as a medievalist. I'm trained as an Iberianist. I devote most of my energies as a teacher and as a scholar looking at the cultural exchanges between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in medieval Spain, and the formative impact of those interactions in the literary history of Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, Catalan, Galician, Portuguese. I also happened to spend some time working with a very dear friend in Italy, Laura Minervini, who is one of the great experts on Judeo-Romance linguistics, and who would emphasize with equal passion, with equal vehemence, Javier's point, that languages evolve, languages change, that there is a diversity within the varieties of Judeo-Romance from the 16th century to the present. And so we must be deeply grateful for the opportunities to document, to celebrate, to preserve that linguistic heritage. I mean, through efforts such as the ones embodied by Andrés' documentary. I'm also delighted because obviously there is a balance between tradition and creativity in the Sephardic heritage. And now you spoke about the appreciation for how things evolve. Part of my role as a medievalist is also to showcase the points of continuity that allow Sephardic culture to serve as well as a resource for medievalists. So for example, and I want to focus briefly not on the language side just, but on the cultural side, the literary side. Whenever, I spend some time editing Hispano-Jewish materials from the Vatican Library and the Biblioteca Palatina in Parma, both Hebrew materials and all Spanish materials in Hebrew script, many of which provide some of the precursors, the pre-modern precursors to the living poetic traditions that are so cherished by the Sephardim. And moreover, whenever I teach an overview of all Spanish literature, as I'm doing this semester actually, when I try to help my students discover the textual growth of Spanish literature from its inception from El Cid to Celestina, you always have at least one wonderful unit devoted to romancero, to a Spanish balladry, to that Iberian branch of this pan-European tradition of of narrative poetry that flourished between the 1200s and the 1500s all over Europe, the Scandinavian vizier, in some of French traditions. And when I'm teaching about the medieval romancero, Sephardic balladry is indispensable. Why? Because the the Spanish ballads, these romances, are examples of narrative poems in popular stylistic registers, octosyllabic verses. Most of them are beautiful song retellings of episodic fragments from longer epic or novelist traditions that take a life of their own in Hispanic societies. And some of these, there are a wide range of ballads, a wide range of these poems that were cherished by Spanish Jews. And after their expulsion, they not only took those oral poems with them, but they contribute to their evolution, to their transformation. They enrich, their cultural heritage with these wonderful poems. They are, exquisite, luminous fragments, of vivid poetic imagination, accompanied by an equally diverse range of melodies that were part of the Sephardic heritage. And when you look at the modern oral tradition of the Sephardim, you find both the creativity, their contributions to that tradition, and also points of continuity with their medieval origins. The tenacity of memory that endures in the reinvention of this motif as they are belabored in the course of centuries from one generation to the next. And we had a wonderful example in this documentary. Indeed, it's actually, and I tell you, my colleagues in medieval studies, they need to know everything about modern oral traditions of balladry to properly study the medieval balladistic heritage. Now, Regina recited a reelaboration, as Andrés explains, of La Dama y el Pastor. Now, La Dama y el Pastor, as you pointed out, and you had a wonderful illustration, is probably the oldest documented Spanish ballad of medieval origin in our textual tradition. In 1421, this Majorcan student of law, Jacques Meolesa, who was at the University of Bologna in Italy, jotted down in one of his notebooks this brief version of La Dama y el Pastor, an old Spanish ballad with a lot of Catalan words peppered in. That poem was incredibly popular in the early modern period. Now, it is not preserved in the 16th century anthologies, but we have plenty of 16th century chatbooks that record either the earliest versions of the poems she sang or amplified versions with glosses and additions. We have chatbooks, pliegos, from preserved now in Madrid, in Prague, in London. Moreover, I was looking with a friend of mine in Jerusalem at these Sephardic hymn books, these anthologies of Hebrew hymns that are sung in the synagogues. And there is at least one from around 1525, which also provides the incipits, I mean, the first lines of Spanish poems. Why? Because the anthologist points out how you should use the traditional melodies associated with those old Spanish songs to interpret these Hebrew prayers. And La Dama y el Pastor is found therein. Moreover, we find very extensive villancicos, elaborate versions of the same poem. The earliest one is from 1525 by Arnaldo Arnaute. And that particular amplified version is the one that took a life of its own through modern times. We find it in Spain, both in Spanish and in Catalan. We find it over Latin America. And we find it in both main branches of modern Sephardic tradition, Levantine Sephardic poetry and North African Sephardic poetry. And that's the version that our friend Regina interprets and glosses, throughout the documentary, which is quite remarkable. This is this medieval novelist archetype, which represents an Iberian inversion of the Provençal and the old French pastorales. We are talking about 14th, 15th century. And that these poems evolved in the course of 6 centuries and were still part of the imagination and of the cultural sensibilities of this elderly Sephardic woman from Rhodes who finds herself in LA at the end of the 20th century. That's quite remarkable. It's quite the same. One of my friends introduced me to a Moroccan Sephardic Jewish woman who sang for me a version of El Sueño de Doña Alda, which is actually a fragment of a late medieval elaboration of the Carolingian epic about Roland. And again, you find this Sephardic Jewish woman from Morocco singing about the heroic exploits of Roland's widow from medieval French poetry. So yes, there is an interesting balance between innovation and tradition. And we have a great duty to appreciate both the creativity of the Sephardim and also to preserve their living heritage, both for its intrinsic value, beauty, for the human testimony to survival that it offers, and as a resource that also provides a privileged glimpse into the pre-modern roots of this magnificent civilization. And for all that, I'm deeply grateful for the likes of Andrés and his wonderful contribution. So I think we can have now a conversation.
Thank you. ¿Sí? ¿Sí? Perdón. Gracias. Thank you very much. Gracias por el documental y por las interesantes explicaciones que nos han dado. Yo quería preguntarles, a raíz de lo que ha dicho don Luis, ustedes conocen conocen porque existe cross connections between the different, lo voy a decir en español, las diferentes ramas geográficas de los sefardíes. Es decir, usted ha mencionado hace un momento el norte de África. ¿Hay interinfluencias entre esos del norte de África, los de Rodas o los de Salónica, etcétera? Es decir, ¿ha habido comunicación o han sido grupos que han cogido influencias de esa zona, pero que luego no ha habido cruce entre ellos en alguna manera en los tiempos más recientes, más modernos? Gracias.
Lo digo en español. Entonces. Yeah, there is a cross communication between Jewish communities, Sephardic Jewish communities, from the Estrecho, from Morocco and the Ottoman Empire. So I don't know in terms of literature or a literature and transmission, but in terms of language, there's pretty marked differences between the Haketiac, which is the variety of the Moroccan Ladino or the Moroccan Judeo-Spanish, and the Eastern Ladino from the. But there was social and religious. For example, the Bible. There was no Bibles there was no press in Morocco, for example, for Hebrew books, and they would borrow books from the peers in the Ottoman Empire. So there was rabbis would travel, and so there was pretty much communication between all of them.
If I may add something to that, my informants when I was doing field work, they would tell me that the people from Rhodes, they did have through trade, they had relations with people from other areas. But what is kind of interesting, something that happened in the United States, when the Sephardim moved to the United States, like in New York or in Los Angeles, they had different synagogues or different organizations to support immigrants depending on their geographical origin. So you had the Salonika people or the Rhodes people, and it's incredibly how much they resisted to merge. They were very insular in a way, and only we saw the case of Los Angeles was very late in 1993 when finally they decided to merge, and they had been conversing about that since the 1920s, but they would never. Rebecca says, it was so great before, everybody from the same town. Now we're mixed. She's lamenting that. So it's kind of interesting that too. How and in New York, the same thing happened. They had their different communities. They remained separate for a long time. So.
It's perhaps just one minor addition. I mean, it's important to remember that there were certain political contexts that frame the separate development, the separate linguistic and cultural developments within different parts of the Sephardic world. So you find, the Sephardic communities in Italy, in the Balkans, and especially the ones from the Balkans and the Near East under Ottoman rule. There were certain channels of communication and moments of continuity that somehow explained for parallel developments in these Sephardic clusters, whereas North African communities, which are steeped in Arabophone societies separate from the Ottomans, have their distinctive developments. So linguistically, and again, I am not a scholar of modern Sephardic studies. Usually I would have just rung up my dear late friend Sam Armistead, who passed away, and he was truly, a walking encyclopedia of modern Sephardic tradition across the board. But yes, North Africa has certain developments. The Sephardic communities under Ottoman rule had their own linguistic and cultural developments. But there was also communication across those boundaries. Now, vernacular developments, the kind of, say, the features of the language that you use when you're communicating to each other, that has particular traits that evolve in the context of its users. Whereas there were certain materials, some of the biblical translations, the commentaries that were used, the exegetical resources that became available in Ladino translation, those circulated widely across the North African Ottoman divide. And as you point out, once they come to, once they survive, the Nazi genocide, they find themselves in a situation where they have to meet each other and trying to join resources, whether they were happy or not at first, to do so.
But let me add something. The reluctancy that Andrés is talking about is not just proper from islands. that goes back to the 16th century when they left Spain, and they would settle in the Ottoman Empire. They would keep themselves separate in different synagogues, depending if they came from Aragon or Castile or Barcelona. So it's pretty old, this reluctancy.
Which also reminds me, the other point Laura would have made. No, this is all coming back slowly. No, but actually one of the things to keep in mind when you talk about Judeo-Spanish as a living language, the Sephardic Jews that resettled around the Mediterranean basin in the aftermath of the expulsion, first from Castile, then from Aragon, they spoke a variety of Ibero-Romance vernaculars. You had Catalan speakers, Castilian speakers, Aragonese speakers. So Judeo-Spanish proper first comes out as the Judeo-Romance koine that developed among communities as they communicate with each other, because they already brought, the linguistic diversity of the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the late Middle Ages along with them. So we use Judeo-Spanish as a rubric to characterize the common language that evolved in particular geographical domains as the product of transformation out of the various dialects that they carried with them.
Thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. I'm curious to know what the presence of the Greek language is in the language of the Sephardic Jews of Rhodes. Did they speak the Greek language while were resistant? I'm very curious to know.
In the case of Rhodes, the island of Rhodes had the Turkish community, Greek community, and then the Jewish community. And especially people that work, the Sephardic Jews that work in trade, they would know some Turkish and some Greek, because obviously they had to, deal with people outside of the Jewish quarter, right? So that was not uncommon. And in fact, there are some Greek words in Ladino, right?
Yeah, there's some. And for example, in the Bible that was published in Constantinople in the 16th century, it was a trilingual Bible. It was you had Ladino, you had the Hebrew text, and you had the modern Greek addressed to the other community. So they were pretty separated, I think, and just only some words would enter the language, like Turkish or French, but no, I don't think they would use on a daily basis the Greek language.
Although I will point out, one of the interesting contingencies in literary history, one of the ballads that I love teaching my students when I do the Old Spanish survey is La Bella y Misa, which some of you may know, actually. It's a wonderful text of this woman who has been abandoned by her groom in order to marry someone else. And she decides that she's going to bring him back into her life. So at her mother's behest, she dresses herself up in her best finery. She shows up at church just when the guy is about to marry this other woman. But she's so resplendent, so gorgeous, so hauntingly beautiful that the acolytes start babbling. The priest can no longer figure out what parts of Mass he was celebrating. The groom faints, and when he wakes up, he dismisses the other woman and marries her instead. Now, this is, and there is a particular episode of that story that was very popular, that became popularized in the Romancero tradition. That story, its earliest archetype was a Greek poem. It was a Greek wedding poem. The Greek poem was brought to the Iberian Peninsula by Catalan speakers from the Balkans during the medieval Catalan colonies in Magna Graecia. Then in Spain, it was translated and divulged in Castilian, in Portuguese, in Catalan, and the Sephardic Jews from Spain, when they go back to Greece and they start learning Greek, they discover the original roots of the early material, and they brought elements that actually enrich and transform I mean, the textual archetype of that ballad. So there was an interesting body of cultural exchange as these materials traveled back and forth. And all the host cultures of the societies where Sephardic Jews lived helped to enrich their cultural archives and their linguistic and their language.
I just wanted to make sure that we remember Dina Levi Lida in this conversation. I don't know whether, Andrés, whether you had occasion to meet her. She was married to Raimundo Lida, a professor in this department who was my ponente de tesis many years ago, an extraordinary man. But she was born and grew up in New York City, in a Sephardic community. Her father was Turkish and her mother Greek. And her mother lived with her until the age of 100 here in Cambridge. And one of Dina's scholarly projects, she was professor at Brandeis of Spanish and comparative literature. She was a polyglot. She was a native speaker of Ladino and Greek and English. In New York City, and had many other languages in her toolkit. And one of her scholarly projects was a refranero of Sephardic refranes, proverbs, and her principal source was her mother. And they were very local proverbs, and this is a resource that is available in our libraries. And a wonderful refranero that is both connected to other parts of the Hispanic world and, of course, to Spain, but a very local, doubly local, because it had originated, I think, in Thessalonica, and if I remember correctly, but then was also very local in terms of the Sephardic community in New York City. And so I wanted to bring her into the conversation. I wish she were here to contribute to that, because she would have treasures to tell us.
I think probably to build off of what you were just saying about bringing additional resources in, and I think to build off of your comment about when a native speaker dies, part of that dies with. My mother grew up in that community, and she is in the Los Angeles Rhodes community. And she remembers as a baby going to that temple, but more the Santa Barbara one. And so I'm third generation Sephardic, and she has always made it a very important part of our life. But I think for me, a soft spot was seeing the gentleman in the documentary and having that second generation and him saying, well, we thought it was completely, silly to learn it when we were little, but now we wish that we had preserved that more so, because I remember my brothers and I growing up, and we'd have the food and the boregas and the yaprak and the, Megina and Passover, and we're like, oh, Mom, you're making this again. And then, now my favorite thing to do is make all of the recipes that are in my grandmother's book. And, I would have loved to know more Ladino than what I know out of the book and what my mom said. And I remember having the same, conversation of, Mom, that's not how you say huevos. That's how you say, there was or that's not how you say hijo. And because I learned modern Spanish, and I knew the few Ladino words that she had taught me, and she could understand from her mother and aunts, but didn't know any past that point. So, I wish that there were more resources around that could bring that in, and it's wonderful that you brought the documentary and that you built it, and that, all of you are here to sort of add that perception of culture and linguists and everything into it. So I really appreciated it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, the film has been screened in LA, and there was a lot of people from the Rhodes group were there, and for many of them was a very emotional film, and to me was a very moving experience to be there. The daughters of Regina were there, and they were crying. I mean, for them to see that this world has vanished. They wouldn't imagine how fast, really, because they were alive just 15 years ago, and now they're gone. So yeah, there is a lot of this feeling of sort of loss, of regret, but life goes on, really, and there are many other things that are important and are fine, and we can't really have everything, right? But I think like I said before, I feel fortunate that I was able to at least, get a little bit of that, to document it so people can see it and understand what happened, and also see what kind of pressure people had. Their community leaders, they're telling them, you have to learn English, That was a time when people felt that was the right thing to do, right? And now it's different. Now a lot of people feel they have to have a stronger ethnic identity, but that was not the case back then. So you can't really blame them because they were doing just what was the right thing to do, what everybody was doing, yeah.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I am an amateur at this, and I have embarked in I would say, an uphill battle, trying to prove something that is totally contradictory to your statements about Ladino or Judeo-Español being a language, the Spanish language of the 15th century. I am just beginning, but the Sephardic Jews that I have spoken to, I have interviewed from different countries, and I must say, not all the countries, of course. I haven't talked to people from North Africa, but from Turkey and from Greece. And setting aside the lexical influences, of each of these languages, let's say the Turkish language or the Greek language, setting that aside, I find that they're speaking the same way. Phonetically, they sound the same to me, which tells me if they're from different communities, to me, this is one possible evidence that the language, phonetically speaking, is the language of the 15th century, the Spanish language. So I'm in the process of continuing my search and my interviews, and hopefully, if the North African Sephardic Jews speak more or less the same way, I can say that this sort of proves that it's not frozen because it's alive. I'm not saying that it's frozen. I say that it's alive, but it's like jumping back, getting into the time machine and jumping back. Now here at Plymouth in Massachusetts, we have the Plymouth Plantation. I don't know if any of you is familiar with it. And it's not just a festival. It's not a week or what day. I believe it's open all year round. And people go there to visit, to see how the pilgrims lived in the 17th century. And they imitate the language. But that is an imitation. That is a supposition of how English sounded in those days, because there hasn't been a continuity of that language the way it was spoken. So it's just an imitation. We suppose this is the way it was spoken, so let's speak it that way. Let's pronounce it that way. However, the Sephardic Jews are speaking a language which has had a continuity through the centuries. And to me, it sounds the same, whether it's in Greece or in Turkey. And I'm wondering what you can tell me about that.
I think they're tricking you. I mean, because there are different varieties of Judeo-Spanish in the Ottoman Empire, and the pronunciation is pretty different also, depending on different cities in which they settled. For example, in one of the varieties, they would say Ijo. In other varieties, they would say Fijo. In Morocco, they would say Hijo. And in other parts, they would say Iju, with an U at the end, because it's the vowel is closed. And the truth is that the phonetic system of the Sephardim, of the Judeo-Spanish language, preserved some sounds of the medieval Spanish that were lost later in modern Spanish. And that is what, some people when hear that think that they are speaking medieval Spanish just because they sound like that, but it's just the sounds. But not, not the syntax, completely different, morphology, completely different, nothing to do with medieval Spanish at all. And just the phonology, I mean, it's probably closer to medieval Spanish than modern Spanish is, but it's still different. Some lost the initial F, like Ijo, for Fijo, which is the medieval form, and some not. So there's variation, lots of variation in Spanish. Spanish is all variation. So you should contrast your informants.
But
they're tricking you.
Well, let me tell you, the people I spoke to, one person would say at one given moment Fijo, and later Ijo. And I stopped and I said, you use both forms. Yes, she couldn't explain to me why, which tells me one thing, which is we're talking about a period where the Castilian language is evolving, where the F is being lost, but it's still there. So, reading anything, not medieval, but early modern, let's say, I don't know, La Celestina, El Lazarillo, El Quijote, which is later, we find certain things that look like in modern Spanish mistakes, like el laísmo, and then we don't in the same text, so it's a period of transition, great transition, I think, and so.
Yeah, I think maybe during the coffee we can, continue the discussion, because we don't want to get too technical here. I mean, there are a number of references where you can see that we can provide you about the variation. The Aldina Quintana book, for instance, and about the innovations. The Penny has a good. So, just to not get too technical into too much detail with the phonetics of the history of Judeo-Spanish. Yeah.
I guess, the only thing I would add, and again, there is extensive bibliography on every feature, in the formation of Judeo-Spanish, and also extensive bibliography on what we can reconstruct about the varieties of Old Spanish. But I guess the main point beyond the technicality, the balance between continuity and change. There are certain archaic features in modern varieties of Judeo-Spanish that have their counterpart in what we know about Old Spanish, and there are also elements in Judeo-Spanish that are different from what we know about Old Spanish. And we can discuss them at length, but I think that is quite, and again, obviously one of my great passions here is being able to appreciate the continuities, but celebrate the newness of the tradition. But we have to be careful, and of course, I pay my respects to the linguists. I just spend time reading good poetry and just enjoying it. But the linguists can give us wonderful, precise descriptions, of how to read the textual archives of Romance languages to decipher what it tells us about voices that are lost. Indeed, in many ways, we have a different problem. With medieval Spanish, we use the graphic representation of those Romance vernaculars as preserved in medieval texts to reconstruct how they spoke. We don't have recordings of medieval speakers, but we do have great recordings, of Judeo-Spanish ones. We have enough knowledge of how Old Spanish was, also evolved to compare and contrast. But giving aside questions of origins, which always give headaches to people. People get always bogged down about who got it first, is this a relic or not. Let us just enjoy and celebrate, what we have experienced in the documentary. And I think with Francisco's permission, we should go and have those cookies and milk, because as far as I'm concerned, the weather outside is horrible, my feet hurt, and it's time to go and wrap up. Thank you.